Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Benoni defense with the most underrated version of the Benoni, the Old Benoni, which is still interesting and has its own venoms, advantages and disadvantages. I'm firstly going to talk about the idea behind the move c5 on move 1, which is the Old Benoni. I'm going to talk about the options white has, so he can obviously take the pawn, he can defend his d4 pawn, and he can just ignore what black is doing. And then we are going to talk about using the Old Benoni to transpose to some other variations of the opening, which might be useful, getting your opponent out of theory, out of prep, using a different move order. Then we are going to be looking at positions where white plays the move knight f3, trying to confuse you. And we are also going to talk about, of course, the main lines in the Old Benoni and what the idea behind the opening is. So to start with, let's talk about what the Old Benoni is. So the Old Benoni is playing the move c5 immediately. If you've seen the introductory video on the Benoni, you will know that there are different ways to enter the opening. For example, entering the modern Benoni starts after white plays d4, black plays knight f6, c4, c5, white plays d5, which is the main move, and black plays the move e6. So in this case, after d4, black continued with knight f6. Now, of course, after knight f6, you are not giving away what you are trying to play yet. So from here, this could still be the Nimzo Indian, it could be the Grunfeld, it could be the King's Indian. You might even enter the London system. If white plays knight f3, you play d5, he plays bishop f4. You could enter the Kole, you could still enter the Transposing with bishop to g5. So this is slightly riskier, going for the modern Benoni and going for the main lines. For example, the Benko Gambit. If you're expecting the Benko Gambit and white to play c4, you're going to play c5, he's going to play d5, and you will play b5. Well, if he plays d4, you play knight f6, and he plays bishop g5, you're not playing the Benoni anymore. You have to defend against the Transposing attack. So the move knight f6 has its disadvantages because you are not sure that you are going to be playing the Benoni. In the Old Benoni, when you play the move c5 immediately, you are restricting white's options, and that's the biggest advantage of the Old Benoni. You are basically saying, well, you're not playing the Transposing, you're not playing the London system, you're not playing the Kole system, you're not playing anything but Benoni-like positions, except there are exceptions, as we are going to see. So what's the move c5 about? White has developed his queen pawn to d4, seizing the center, controlling the square c5 and the square e5. If you allow white to expand with a broad center with moves like c4 and d4, well, then you are going to be playing a modern opening, such as the King's Indian, Pirts, or the modern, in which you have to fight for central control with your pieces, mostly with your bishops from the flanks. The Benoni, and especially the Old Benoni, tries to disrupt white's central control immediately. So what you are doing is saying to white, well, you're not going to be controlling the center with your d4 pawn anymore, because A, I'm going to take it, B, you're going to take my pawn, or you're not going to, and you're not going to have your d4 pawn, or C, which is the main option, you're going to advance your pawn to d5, and that way you are no longer controlling e5, you are no longer attacking my c5 pawn. So let's look at white's options. If you're unfamiliar with the opening and you see this over the board, of course, your tactical sensors are going to start blinking and you're going to see, well, the pawn is hanging, I can just take it. So let's talk about that first. What happens if white takes the pawn? Well, now, long term, you can be happy because you have an advantage similar to one in the Sicilian defense. You have traded off your flank pawn for white's central pawn, or the central pawn is still on the board, but eventually you will capture the pawn back. So you have basically traded your c7 pawn for white's d2 pawn, which is a big advantage because central pawns are more valuable. So what can we do here? After the move d takes c5, we are going to be looking at only one move for black, and the move is going to make perfect sense. It's the main move, the best move, and there are no better moves on the board. The move is e6. What you are doing with e6, you are reinforcing the move pawn to d5 once the c5 pawn has been eliminated from the board. And you are also opening up your f8 bishop to simply recapture the material and have a better position, as I said, because you have traded off your flank pawn for white's central pawn. Now, on grandmaster level, d takes c5 has been played, but with the correct continuations. White can choose to do two different things here. The first thing is he can try to hold on to the material. The second thing is he can let the material go and accept the fact that he has traded off his central pawn for black's flank pawn. So how do we hold on to the material? Let's look at that. There are two bad moves to try and defend the pawn. The first bad move, both visually and practically, is the move bishop e3. Bishop e3 simply defends the pawn while you are blocking in your e4 pawn. So if you've seen the introductory video to the Benoni, or the video in the modern Benoni, or the video on the Benko, you will know that white is trying to expand in the center with the move e4, and otherwise you are going to have to play g3, bishop g2, fianchetto your bishop, and you basically have a bishop on a very awkward square. Furthermore, this move doesn't even defend the pawn sufficiently because black can just play the move knight a6, and this has been played several times. Black won the majority of the games, if not all of them. You basically have no way to defend the pawn anymore. You can play knight c3, a developing move, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now bishop takes c5. Whatever white does now, you have an extra central pawn, you're going to play d5, you will simply be better. So after the move e6, bishop e3 is not a good move. The most obvious way to defend, which happens often in queen's pawn openings, where where one side takes the c pawn and tries to hold on to it, white may try to play the move b4. And let's learn how to refute this. When the c pawn is defended with the b pawn early on in the opening, usually you can use the fact that the rooks are pinned to the pawns, and that if the a file opens up completely, one of the rooks is going to be hanging. We are going to use that fact here. The only way to play this position, if you continue normally with something like knight f6 and white gets in the move bishop b2, well then he has an extra pawn. But you have to strike immediately with the move a5. And now black has at least equalized already, which if you are on move 3 with the white pieces, that's a bad thing. So after the move a5, there are no good responses. Let's eliminate them one by one. The most obvious one is the move a3. After a3, you use the fact that the rook is hanging and you simply take the pawn. White cannot recapture. The rook is unpre. After a5, the second most obvious move is the so-called Old Benoni trap, which is the move c3. After c3, you can pause your videos to find the correct move for black if you would like to. Okay, after c3, you simply take the pawn anyway, and after a takes b4, if white wishes not to lose a pawn, because, well, your next move is going to be bishop takes c5, if he takes, then the move is queen f6, and after queen f6, white is simply losing the a1 rook and black wins the game. So the most obvious two defenses, a3 and c3, both fail. a3 simply loses a pawn, c3 loses either a pawn or two pawns or a rook, depending on how the position goes. So the two other moves he could try and play, the first one and probably the most obvious is simply to capture the pawn, but if you take on a5, queen a5 is check. If you try to defend with something like bishop d2 or queen d2, simply queen takes c5, and as you can see in this position the material is equal, but black has the center, he's going to play d5. He has an extra central pawn on the d file, which is huge. Open a file for the rook, a2 is under pressure, and this position is virtually winning for black on a high level. And the last move white could go for is the move b5, but after b5 you simply take the c5 pawn, and something like bishop b2, knight f6, this pawn is really weak. He would have to defend it with something like a4. You have gained time. Your bishop can no longer be challenged because the b pawn is not able to play itself back to b4. So what you are going to do as black is b6, bishop b7. You are going to have two monster bishops and a better position. So let's go over that again. If after the Old Benoni, white takes the pawn, and you play e6, and he tries to hold on to the material with something like bishop e3 or b4, there are easy ways to refute that. If bishop e3, you play knight a6, win the pawn back. If b4, you simply play a5, and white has four bad moves, which lead to a bad position. So what can white do after e6? As we said, this has been played on the grandmaster level, and it's not a losing position. So there are two moves. One move is e4, simply giving the material back, expanding in the center, after which black just takes, and now you have the long-term advantage of having a central pawn. Bishop d3, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, normal development, and an equal position, which is very important for black to have equalized so early on in the opening. The main move, though, is not e4. The main move is knight c3, again giving up the material. Bishop takes c5. And now the tricky way for white to play is to play the move knight e4. Here black has two good options. One of them is knight f6, the other one is d5. Neither lose a piece, if you were wondering, because black has the move queen a5 check. So you basically want to develop as soon as possible, take up the center, and you don't mind giving up your bishop pair if you're going to have a lead in development. So knight f6, if white takes the knight, then you're just much better. He has to take the bishop. Now queen a5 check. Queen to d2, queen takes knight. Later on, you want to play the move d5 and expand. So you are playing for central control. So if white takes the gambit, or accepts the old Benoni gambit, black has a comfortable game ahead. Now let's look at the other options. What if white defends the pawn? So after c5, there are two ways to defend the pawn. You don't have to push the pawn to d5, which is the main line. You don't have to take on c5. You can either play c3 or e3 to defend the pawn. You can also play knight f3, but that's almost never played. So let's look at e3 first. You now have to be cold-blooded and keep this tension in the center. Don't panic and don't think that white is going to take your pawn for free later on. Just develop. Knight f6, knight f3, g6, it's a Benoni, so you want to fianchetto your bishop, bishop e2, bishop g7. Here you can either do dc5, white can either do dc5 or castle. If he takes dc5, as I said, don't worry about this. You're going to play knight a6, and there are no ways to defend this pawn. Well, white could go queen to d4, but that's just absurd. So the best move for white is bishop takes a6, and after b takes a6, castles bishop b7. You're a pawn down for the moment, but who would like to be white here? This bishop is the best piece on the board. The c5 pawn is loose anyway. Something like rook c8 is going to win the pawn back. So after bishop g7, the best move for white is castles. You castle, and now white transposes to a normal queen's pawn opening with c4. As soon as c4 is played, you take cd, ed, and you play d5, break open the center. And now, if you are unfamiliar with the Grunfeld defense, I'm sorry, but this is a Grunfeld type position with the fianchettoed bishop on g7 and the pawn on d5. That's the bad news for old Benoni players. If you are unfamiliar with the Grunfeld, the defense of the pawn with d3 could very easily lead to Grunfeld type positions, and most defenses to d4 tend to be transpositional, so it's good to have a good general knowledge in all. So check out the Grunfeld to be able to play this position well. After c5, the other way to defend is c3, sort of going for either London system setup or reversed semi-Slav or Slav setup. So here you can, of course, go d5, going into a normal Queen's Gambit Slav position, a tempo down, which isn't good. So you go e6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop g5, pinning your knight, h6, and here, and this is the main line and the only series of moves which is played after strong players defend the d4 pawn with c3. Here white has a sort of hard decision to make. Either take on f6, give up the bishop pair, or retreat the bishop to h4, which is inferior to that. So if bishop h4, you simply continue with b6, and after e3, bishop b7. Great bishop on b7, c5 is defended by the f8 bishop. What you want to do is keep this tension before developing your bishop, so that when white takes, you can recapture with the bishop without having to move it twice. And after h6, if black takes, queen takes f6, e4, white now indeed does get a strong broad center, but cd, bishop b4 check, castling with tempo, knight c3 castles, bishop d3, d6 castles is a fairly comfortable position with the bishop pair. What you want to do is seize the initiative if you can, use your bishop pair, open the position up to make your bishop stronger. Obviously you want to play b6, bishop b7. Then something like d5 or e5 comes to mind, and you want to make your bishops powerful here. So when white defends the pawn, again, you should not be worried. The old Benoni is a sound opening, and white doesn't have such an easy game, whatever he does, unless he plays the main move. If white plays the main move, let's see what happens. So after c5, the main move is not defending the pawn, it's not taking, it's advancing. d5. And now if you've seen the video on the modern Benoni, again, let's look at that. So d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6. Black disrupts white central control immediately, so we get the position after knight c3 takes, pawn takes, d6. Now we get the position in which the e file is open, and white can use it to create an attack with moves like e4, e5, f4, and the e file is basically shared. It's a semi-open e file, so before the white pawn gets to e5, black is going to be the one using it with, well, more danger for the other side, because the black rook from f8 is coming to e8, firstly stopping e5, secondly exerting pressure over the whole file. So if the white king finds itself in the center, the e file is more useful for black. And the Old Benoni is kind of a different story. The main difference between the Old Benoni and all the other variations of the Benoni, except for the Czech Benoni, is that you keep your pawn on d6 without playing e6. Now, on the highest level, if you try to find games in the Old Benoni, you are going to see that most of them have e6 later on, because it's just a good move, disrupting white's center and opening up the e file. But the Old Benoni, the proper Old Benoni, is keeping your pawn on e7. Now, what does that mean? Again, if you've seen the modern Benoni, I'm going to open up another board and show it to you once again. So c4, knight f6, d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6, knight c3, takes, d6. In the modern Benoni and in the Benko Gambit, in most lines, the d6 pawn is the biggest weakness, and white uses maneuvers such as knight f3, knight d2, knight c5 to put pressure on the pawn. White is going to play bishop f4 to put pressure on the pawn, and d6, if it drops, you lose. And if you commit too many pieces to the defense of it, you lose anyway. So d6 is a problem, which means that the Old Benoni has an obvious visual and practical advantage over the modern Benoni and the Benko Gambit, and that's the fact that your d6 pawn is defended by your e7 pawn, making it a much lesser weakness. And a move like knight c4, albeit still annoying, doesn't target a loose pawn on d6, and you are quite safe compared to the other lines. You don't lose material. So playing the Old Benoni gives you a structural advantage. You don't have the Benoni weakness on d6. On the other hand, in compensation for white, you don't get the semi-open e file. You don't get to disrupt white central control. White is going to keep two pawns on c4 and d5, or he's going to have a knight on c3 instead of having to push c4 because the d5 pawn is still there. In the modern Benoni, he has to play c4 and then take on d5, because otherwise there would be no pawn in the center. Okay, now let's talk about the weird etymology and the problem with names in the Old Benoni, and the fact that the variations have so confusing names that you are never sure what you're playing. Okay, so let's do that first. In this position, black can either play d6 or knight f6. d6 is the old way to play the Old Benoni. You can play knight f6 and still enter the same position. After knight f6, white has two options, either knight c3 or c4. If c4 is played, there is one way to name this opening. Okay, so if c4 is played, the position can either be called the Old Benoni or the Hromadka system. And if in this position knight c3 is played, the position can be called either the Old Benoni or the Benoni Indian defense, which is quite confusing, but that's the way it is. So if knight c3, it should be the Benoni Indian defense. If c4, it should be the Hromadka system or the Old Benoni. But anyway, after knight f6 and c4, white has tried to enter the main lines of the Benoni defense. So if you know what options black has here, you know that we can transpose to several different openings, which we are going to be looking at in a minute. If you play d6, this is now the Old Benoni. You can also play g6, and then after knight c3 play d6. You are basically playing with this pawn structure. You want to fianchetto your bishop, and you want to keep your e-pawn on e7 for the time being because you wanted to defend d6. So this now can be called the Hramatka system or the Old Benoni. And if after knight f6, white plays the move knight c3, and you go d6, he goes e4, g6, this can be called the Old Benoni or the Benoni Indian defense. So the Old Benoni, if you look at it on Lichess, chess.com, chessgames.com, any other explorer, can have three names: Hramatka system, Old Benoni, or the Benoni Indian defense. Okay, now let's look at the transpositions. After d4, d5, d4, c5, d5, black doesn't have to play the Old Benoni. Black can enter any of the three variations of the Benoni he wishes to enter. So without playing the move d6, giving yourself flexibility with knight f6, you keep the option of playing the Old Benoni, the Modern Benoni, the Benko Gambit, and the Czech Benoni. And let's see that. So white is going to continue with c4, which is the best move and the only move. Now, if you play the move e6, you have entered the Modern Benoni. So knight c3, takes, takes, d6. If after c4 you play the move b5, you have entered the Benko Gambit. If after c4 you play the move e5 and knight c3, d6, you now have the Czech Benoni or the closed Benoni. So the flexibility of the move c5 gives you the option to play the Old Benoni, but you can also play the other three variations. After c4, you can, of course, after e6, knight c3 takes, takes, play the move bishop d6, which is the snake Benoni, which we are going to cover in the last video on the series. So the Old Benoni is very transpositional for both colors. Black can enter 4 different systems in the Benoni. It doesn't have to be the Old Benoni. White can try to avoid it with several ideas. Okay, now before we continue to the main theory, let's look at what happens if white plays the move knight f3. If knight f3 is played, defending the pawn with the knight, and that's what I wanted to keep for last. I said that it's not commonly played, and it's not the best move out of the 3 ways to defend the pawn. You now can either stay in the Benoni, in the Benoni type structure with the move knight f6, and after d5 continue with d6, knight c3, g6, play the Old Benoni. Or you can try to equalize very early on, because knight f3 is a provocative move. The move knight f3 invites a tempo on one of the pieces. So if you take on d4 and queen takes d4, you play knight c6 with tempo. If you take on d4 and he takes with the knight, you can now play the move d5. And early on, after g3, you can play e5, gaining a tempo on this knight and gaining a huge center, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop e6, castles. Black now has huge central control, and that's the reason why the move knight f3 is not popular. So after d4, c5, if knight f3, just take, and whatever he takes with, you're going to get a tempo. Okay, now finally, let's look at the Old Benoni. So as we said, the move d5 is the way white should be playing. You can play either knight f6 or d6 here with black. Knight f6, as we said, can transpose to other lines, but you can also stay in the Old Benoni. Knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, g6, fianchettoing your bishop, e4, white grabs the center, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, and bishop e2. And here is where I would like to stop and talk about this position. So what you can do here with black is go for several different plans. Transposing to a position similar to the Modern Benoni with e6 is the most common way to play. You're basically transposing to the Modern on move 7 instead of entering it on move 3. But as I said, we are not looking into that today. You can watch the video on the Modern Benoni. Modern Benoni ideas are either knight a6 or bishop g4. Bishop g4 is the most interesting move in my opinion because, well, first of all, it tries to get rid of white's f3 knight, which is quite annoying, and it helps you play e6 later on. What do I mean by that? So if you play e6 here, and white castles, and you take on d5, and white takes with the c-pawn, this is something similar to the Modern Benoni. In fact, it is a variation of the Modern Benoni. White is now going to play knight d2, knight c4, and the c4 knight is going to put pressure on your d6 weakness. And that is why after the move bishop e2, you can choose to play the move bishop g4, and after castles, you simply take the knight if you wish, with bishop takes f3 immediately, or you can continue with knight a6, knight bd7, something different. But let's say you take the knight, takes, Bishop takes f3. And now, whatever you do, if you later on choose to play the move e6, let's say you choose to play it here. It's not a good move here, but let's just say white obliges, takes. White now no longer has the knight which can come into c4 and put pressure on your pawn. Okay, so that's one way to play. The other way to play this position, which I think is better after bishop e2, is to continue with the move knight a6. The move knight a6 prepares to put your knight on the c7 square. From c7, your knight is supporting the b5 break, and that's very important in the Benoni. So after castles, knight c7, white is going to play h3 to stop bishop g4. You play a6, white plays a4, trying to stop your b5 break. You play rook b8. So if you are familiar with the Benoni ideas, you know that white wants to play in the center with the moves e4, e5, break open black structure, put pressure on d6. Black, on the other hand, wants to play on the queen side, and his main break is the move b5. If black can get the move b5 in, that means that he is going to be more active on the queen side. His rook is going to be a much better piece than white's rook. And most importantly, the Benoni bishop on g7 becomes the best piece on the board. If you can try to imagine this bishop being unopposed on the dark squares by the pieces, since it's already unopposed by any pawns except for the b2 weakness, then you can see that this bishop is, for example, much better than the c8 bishop, much better than the e2 bishop, and especially much better than its counterpart, the c1 bishop for white. Okay. With d6, after d5, d6, playing the proper Old Benoni and not giving yourself the option to transpose, white is going to play the move e4, which is the main move, the most active move, trying to expand in the center. And now you continue with your plan. Your plan is twofold. Firstly, play g6, bishop g7, and castle. That's the first thing you want to do in the Old Benoni. The second thing is remaneuver your knight from a6 to c7. You can also go for knight d7, and that's a different type of setup, but let's look at this first. So knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2. We have the position we've been looking at a minute ago, castles, and now knight a6 to c7 is one way to play this. E6 is the other way to play this. Bishop g4 is also a popular move. You can also go a6 immediately, preparing b5. After a6, white, of course, has to play a4 right away. And now you can go for the move bishop to g4. And the difference in this position, which we have to look at for a while, and I don't know if you noticed it, I wanted to enter it in this tricky fashion on purpose, is that white hasn't played the move c4, white has played the move knight c3. What does that mean? This means that now, after the move bishop g4, white is able to exert pressure on d6 with his knight from c4, thus making it harder for you to control the center. Okay, so if we return to this position after castles, the move bishop g4 is one of the most popular options immediately. You don't have to play a6 for b5, you don't have to play knight bd7 to control e5, you don't have to play knight a6 to c7 to control b5, you can play bishop g4 immediately. And in this position, white has several options. Bishop f4 is one of them, knight d2 is one of them, h3 is the third option. If h3, that move, in my opinion, helps black because black wants to get rid of his bishop anyway. The only move I would be afraid of here as black is the move knight to d2, which now forces you to trade off your bishop. Queen takes c2, and if you noticed, the white knight is still able to come to c4. So let's continue with knight a6 and knight c4. And now all of a sudden, you have to be careful. Playing the move e6 would lead to the almost inevitable loss of the d6 pawn after something like bishop to f4. So now we have to find a way to play around the knight. White needs to be careful as well. If he doesn't play a4 very soon and you get in a6, b5, the c4 knight is of course going to go away from the c4 square and you're just going to be better. So white plays the move a4, a6, and now if white isn't careful again, you're going to be playing the move b5 with something like rook b8 or queen d7. So what white wants to do is lock down the queen side with the move a5. And now you need to change plans. This is the ideal scenario for white. This is what you're going to be playing if white knows what he is doing. He's going to have an outpost on c4, an outpost on b6, the threat of playing the move e5. What you have is the potential to disrupt his queenside control, the potential to stop e5, the potential to start an attack if you manage to stop e5 and push through on the queenside. So what you want to do, first of all, is to play around with your pieces. You want to remaneuver them to control the e5 square and the b5 square. White is going to try to control his outpost on b6, of course, with knight a4. You play knight b5, c3, stopping anything coming to d4. Queen c7, you want to develop something like bishop f4. And this is now a slow maneuvering position in which you don't have so many attacking chances because you play the old Benoni. If you want to have a more aggressive version of the Benoni, you have to play the move e6, which is riskier because in this case, for example, d6 would almost be terminally weak. But you could also play the move rook f to e8 and put pressure on the queen. So the old Benoni is a safer, less aggressive, it's not risk-free, but it's less risky than the modern Benoni version of the Benoni, which you can play if you want to confuse your opponents. Firstly, it's not popular. It's not nearly as popular as the modern Benoni lines with e6. Secondly, you have the same plans as black, but the plans for white change significantly. If white doesn't know the difference between positions with c4 and knight c3, he's going to be in trouble. If white doesn't know any other plans but to attack the d6 weakness, then he's going to be in trouble. So the old Benoni is an interesting opening. It's hard to find example games in it. I have listed some in the first comment below, which you can study. And yeah, it's not that easy to understand because it's not easy to resist the urge to play the move e6. So my advice would be, if you want to play the old Benoni, and let's look at the position again, e4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight to f3, bishop to g7, let's say bishop to e2, bishop b5 is also possible, castles, castles. Don't be afraid to play the move e6 at some point. Even though you are obviously leaving the old Benoni territory, after something like knight d2 and ed5, don't be afraid to do that because you can have a more dynamic position. So my advice would be, if you're playing somebody your own strength, the old Benoni is fine. If you're playing somebody much stronger or much weaker, just play e6 and complicate the position. Against a much stronger opponent, you want attacking chances. Against a much weaker opponent, you want them as well. So that's what I would do, and that's what I plan to do in my own games. Okay. Thanks for watching. Hope you liked the video on the old Benoni. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.